join me in welcoming Brian Wood. He's the Project Manager, Digital Attack Team, National Geospatial Intelligence Agency, and also Christopher Pittman, who's the Product Designer. And leading our conversation is NextGov's own Mohana Ravindranath. And take it away, Mohana.
Can't tell if this is on. Okay, great. Welcome to Tech and Tequila. Super excited to talk to NGA's Digital Attack Team, which someone else, maybe it was you, described to me as a super aggressive name. And I would really love to know what your mission is in one sentence. What does digital attack mean?
Yeah, when we first got started, it was how could we take a small team, 3 people, and use commercial methodologies such as lean startup, design, things like that to affect strategic mission areas at a fast pace. We're talking less than 6 months. So that was the overall goal.
Would you just echo that, or do you have a different understanding?
That's a great way of capturing it. It was what are some big strategic issues that we can sort of impact down at a human level to actually sort of drive change up through the agency.
And walk us through the structure of the team. How many people are working on things? How are you deployed to certain projects, strategic missions?
Yeah, it's changed over time. When we initially got started, none of us had a background in product development or design or anything. It was all, I think I came from a sales background, and you were an all-source analyst, and we had another geospatial analyst. So a lot of it was just trying to get some very quick training up and going. And we learned a lot over the course of the 9 months working on our project. But since then, we've had additional product designers join, additional developers join, and typically we try and keep it around 3 people, but it depends on the mission that they're actually focused on and how the support mechanisms they have on top of that.
So that means that 3 people would go in and identify a project that other analysts are already working on and then try to help them stand that up? Is that fair characterization?
Yeah, I think you would sort of staff relative to the thing that you discover. The whole sort of idea of the team is we go find undiscovered value. So we go out into the customer space, we sort of watch those customers, we watch how we work with those customers, and then we sort of seek opportunities to maybe create something that sort of helps solve a problem that, was sort of maybe some undiscovered or very difficult problem. So then the team kind of scales around that. What kind of work do we need to do to tackle this? So for us, we at a certain point realized, this is going to be a development problem. We need to actually maybe build some software. So we got a developer. So I think that's kind of one of the ways that we sort of focus on structuring.
And you've talked about doing sort of ethnographic research to understand the customers, the analysts within NGA. So I'm wondering if you can walk us through what that process is. It sounds to me almost like market research in the private sector, or maybe just kind of understanding what your specific customers' needs are.
Yeah, absolutely. So we took a very sort of immersive approach to that kind of research. We built ourselves this very sort of highly notional value chain for the agency. We said, well, who are sort of some of our critical customers, and how do we get value out to them? And then we went and actually just sat at all of those points. We watched people work. We learned how to do jobs. We interviewed, but as much as possible, we prefer sort of watching people and then interviewing them afterwards. Because the idea is when someone's sort of answering interview questions, they're sort of thinking, well, what do they want to hear? What do I think they're trying to do? If you can just watch them work, I think a lot of surprising insight comes out of that. So we did that for about, a couple weeks. I think we probably managed to be in touch with probably about 50, 70 people, somewhere in that range. We traveled to do that. We went to 5 a.m. briefings. It was a lot of work, but what we felt the value of that is you get to ground truth very quickly, and you get to truth that maybe no one has expressed via sort of a requirements process, which is, I think, what we're a little more used to in the government.
What's an example of that, sort of that truth that no one has expressed?
Sure, absolutely. I think one of the best ones was how our products are being used. We are a geospatial agency, and so we produce a lot of visualizations. And one of the things that we saw is the visualizations have a lot of merit on their own, but we were surprised at the way that some customers were combining them with text. Some of the other agencies, some other organizations produce very sort of text-heavy analysis. And so to actually see a briefer put down one of our products next to another agency and be like, so these two together kind of tell the story. And then to see how customers, very senior policymakers, would kind of lean into that a little bit more. That was really an interesting insight that drove a lot of what we then went back into the agency and tried to make easier and tried to make sort of better.
I wanted to talk about Conduit, which is sort of a success story that I've heard about coming out of the digital attack team. It seems to be sort of a content curation system. Is that the right way to describe it? But I guess in what I've heard, it's reduced the time that it takes to compile a briefing, like the briefing material from something like 18 hours to 1 hour. Just walk us through the process of identifying the problem and creating a product and how it's being used.
Yeah, I think the easiest way to describe it is a lot of what we saw was the top news stories were kind of getting sent out to a lot of these policymakers and decision makers, but even some of the stuff at a more strategic level really wasn't making it out. And we were having analysts spend a lot of time build these intelligence products that weren't making it to the end customer because they didn't meet some kind of threshold of importance. So there was some really there's some value in a lot of the work we were doing that just wasn't getting out there. So the way we compared that to is imagine if you got all the news for the day, like from USA Today, New York Times, CNN, and your job was to compile that news and pick out what the important stories were for each of the individuals in this room. Well, if that is your job, how do you even collect that data, especially considering it's only, they may only get 15 minutes in the morning to see these stories. So how are you almost curating content for the content curators? And so we started to look into how could we actually build a content curation tool that learns from what the interactions we're having with the briefers. But when we were going through that process, we're like, okay, we'll just build a machine learning tool that does that. There's content curation tools everywhere. What we found out was the real pain points and the reason why there was so much, there was a ton of effort being put into the actual curation process itself, and it was taking roughly 15 to 18 hours per team with 5 people per day to even just get all of this data together. So we didn't think that they would just pick up a content curation tool and start using it. We actually needed to build a workflow improvement tool that would get them start using it right away, and then we could use that to gain training data off of who they were sending the products to. So after about the first month of development, just building the simple workflow tool ended up taking was taking 5 people 15 hours essentially a day. They could do it with 1 person in less than an hour. And then if you start to scale that across all of our customer teams at different sites, that starts to scale really quickly. So I'm sure you have some additional things to add on top of that.
Yeah, I think like an additional value of that was then, because we had kind of sat with those people and watched them work, we saw all the other things they were trying to do and needing to do throughout the day. They were ultimately like kind of our face out to some of these very important policymaking customer sets. And so this was somewhat tedious. And so getting that time freed up then lets them go and actually have more human interactions, which helps us to fit all of the work that we do sort of better to those customers. So.
And can you talk about some of the cultural challenges when you build a product like this? I'm sure you go in there and you say, well, I fixed your problems, and you come up with this product, and then you realize that some people don't want to use it. So can you talk about sort of selling to your customers a product that you think solves the problem when maybe they don't quite believe it yet?
We can do that.
Yeah, I will say a lot of our roadblocks didn't necessarily have to do with the people wanting to use the software. Everybody was, from what I saw, it was, I will say initially when we first went to go talk to these teams, they thought we were just there, we're going to do an interview, and then we're going to disappear, take the data back to Springfield and then never come back. So when we came back with a mocked up version of what we had talked about with them previously, it kind of opened up the floodgates for feedback, because they were like, whoa, you guys came back. That doesn't happen. And then when we actually started coming back, every couple weeks with, an iterated product and adding in additional features that they themselves were pointing out had issues, the feedback got better and better, and then they started getting the word out for us. I think a lot of our roadblocks from a cultural standpoint came from things like security. Getting software working in a classified environment, and how do you get through all of the if anybody's, I'm sure people are familiar with the ATO process and how long it takes to get through all of that, or do we want to go down the acquisition route, or is it one of the early on decisions we were going down was we had full intentions of going out and acquiring a commercial software, but there were so many problems with just going out, being able to buy a software, get it into our high side environment, get through all the security credentials, and then hope that it works for the team that we're buying this for.
Yeah.
So that, I'd say we learned a lot by going through some of these different processes. Like the security one was kind of interesting because we found out while doing some digging that if you go attach your software product to an already existing product that has security credentials, you can do like a quick change form and you get their security credentials. So we could get on in it took us about 2 weeks rather than 18 months.
It's kind of a hopeful sign. Like that sort of move towards sort of service orientation really helps teams like us, because that's fundamentally what we're doing. Like we're not there to build some big full stack top to bottom. It's we discovered value out with a user base, and we think that's valuable to the agency's mission. So how can we very quickly get that out to them and then iterate on it? That moment where they were like, oh, you came back. That was a huge thing. It's sort of earning trust through that service orientation, I think.
And how long might a process like that last, from the interview stage to actually coming back or to actually delivering a product? I'm sure it varies, but what's the time frame we're talking?
You're like the timekeeper. How long did we? This is the product manager here, so yeah, how long did we spend?
So so right now we're training other teams to do this and to have this product mindset from our actual analysts who are doing the job. How can they build a product team around some of their ideas? And the way that we're teaching them to do it, it typically takes about 2 months. From the idea to actually getting a prototyped version with customer feedback and the data to support actually making a decision to scale it from there. And that's changing some of the ways that NGA is looking at investing in some of the internal development projects that we're working on, where we can hold some of these, what's 2 months in the grand scheme of things, right? You can hold some of these quick turnaround competitions and see which teams kind of really have something of value for us to really put big investment into at the end of a 2-month period. So we're in the process of doing that now, and it's going well.
Sure. I also wanted to talk about the lean startup model, which is it seems like one of the fundamental aspects of the culture that you're trying to imbue the rest of government with. And so, Brian, I know you said you're speaking at the Lean Startup Conference. Just talk about some of the challenges or the opportunities in spreading that methodology within government. Is it something they're used to? I suspect not.
It is a little bit of a different mindset, and people will be very quick to tell you why you can't do it. Oh, we got to go through ATO, we got to go through security. It's going to take too long to get this thing acquired. And really, when it comes down to it, it's about starting smaller. What are some of your riskiest assumptions to you having success in getting your product pushed forward, and what's kind of the minimal piece that you can do to get started to test some of those assumptions? And when we break it down into like a much smaller requirement, if you will, people start to understand, like, okay, I see what we're doing. And when you start to see the iteration on top of that, you start to get believers over time. I think that a lot of what we've done is not try and just tell people, but actually show them, like bring teams in, come do it with us. Let's show you how we can actually build some of these products on an iterative model. And it's been interesting. I know there's a lot of I think people are burnt out on new methodologies sometimes. You hear Agile, you hear, like there's all these things that get thrown out. I mean, I know that Agile acquisition was a big one for us for a long time, and like, what does that even mean? And so when they're talking now about, okay, now we got this lean startup thing. Well, we're not a startup, we're an enterprise. But how do you kind of match that startup speed in a government agency? And there's a lot of people that are starting to become believers, and you'll see the pockets, and it starts to spread just by proof and execution.
Yeah, I think part of that's kind of inculcating a product mindset at like all parts of the agency. The idea that you, in your job at your desk, have somebody that you deliver value to, and the best question you can ask yourself is, what do you help that somebody do? So who's your customer? What do you help them do? And then if we can get people at that level, and then say, so take that as an assumption now. Like, how would you go test that? What's the sort of quickest, cheapest way you could do that? That idea of doing sort of small little tests actually ends up being really freeing for people. It's a little scary to stare into the abyss of like, am I assuming things about my customer? But as soon as you're actually sort of willing to do that, people kind of want to find out. They want to go see what that ground truth is. And so then I think it's just a question of making it seem like it won't be too difficult. It won't take too long. You can test this in a week. You can test this in 2 weeks. I think that's been one of the ways that we've sort of been able to sort of work with people and help them get into that mindset.
So other groups like 18F and the U.S. Digital Service often talk about some of the same things, like lean startup methodology, Agile. But it seems like your model is fundamentally different. They recruit from the private sector on short-term stints. They do have a cultural mission, but I think a lot of those people are intending to go back afterwards. And it seems like the digital attack team is pretty much people who have been in government for a while and sort of intend to stay. Are you looking at recruiting from the private sector and replicating those models? And how closely do you work with those other pockets of sort of innovation outside?
Yeah, I'd say that we as a team really did focus internally. I know that USDS and 18F really opened up the doors for us to do a lot of this work that we're doing in the first place. And they there's a lot of reference points that we can point back to work that they've done that we can bring back to NGA. And 18F actually is supporting some of the work we're doing in our acquisition office as well. As far as the recruiting goes, I know that there's some efforts over in our HD organization. I know they're looking at how could they mimic the model from 18F to bring in, especially on the development side and the data science side, and some of the unique skill sets that are harder to recruit for in a classified environment. And how can we use some of the unclassed skills in part of the classified work that we're doing. I don't have much detail on the recruiting side other than that, but I know the people who are doing it, and I know that it is a push for the agency on recruiting.
And I think there's we definitely as a team, we formed around this concept that government employees can do this work. They can do innovation work. They can move in very quick iterations. They can go discover value. We think that's definitely true. There's definitely a place for bringing in people. I think we get some of our best ideas that way and some of our best ways of work. I mean, Lean Startup did not start in the government. However, I think it will really find a home there because a lot of people do have this capacity for creativity there. It's kind of a nature versus nurture question, but I think there is a creative nature to a lot of federal workers. And so what we're trying to do is just kind of give them the ability to exercise that in a way that then, most importantly, is meaningful for our mission as an agency and sort of to our partners.
And can you talk a little more about the actual technology you're working on? So what, maybe name the top 3 things you're focusing on. We've talked about Conduit, but maybe other projects that you think are super exciting, anything that's finished or in the hopper?
Yeah, everybody's talking AI, right? Everybody wants to know, what are you doing in AI? How many AI projects does your agency have? I know NGA likes to use the term automation rather than the whole AI, big focus. There's an entire division that's focused on that now. So there's a lot of people really focused on how can we automate some of the pieces of our agency, especially some of the tedious tasks that our analysts have to do on a day-to-day basis. There's another really cool thing that our office is working on. We're not part of this team, but we're standing up a public-private partnership interface office, and they're trying to figure out how could we take all of this data we have. We have years and years and years of data, and there's people conditioning it to be used as training data. How can we take that data and give it out to companies with the expectation that any of the technology that they build off of that, they would share back to us, almost like a trade of, here's our training data, now, can we have access to the product that you just built out of it, or whatever they do with it? We'd have access to that other side of data. So one of the guys who actually used to work on the digital attack team, one of the original 3 is heading up that office and that effort. And I believe he said next week they're putting out a market survey on Fed BizOps just to gain interest. He's just doing some basic discovery on people. Are people even interested in having our training data? Would they be interested in trading some of their code for our data? So he's just trying to gauge, is there interest around that?
Yeah, kind of in the spirit of Lean Startup, let's test this. Let's actually get it out there. So,
and then cybersecurity would be the third that I think is always a big one. But that's way out of my level of understanding.
But it's worth noting, especially for how our team works, we're not tech first. If we get handed a tech problem, we did this last time, we tend to sort of leave it for a minute and go sort of see where people are living, and then how we're going to impact those people and what problem we think we're solving and what problem we discover. That then kind of influences what kind of technology we need to get our heads around. So a good example of this was actually on Conduit. As we were realizing this is a content curation and maybe machine learning problem, we said, well, we're not experts on machine learning algorithms. So we hosted a hackathon out in Seattle. We just said, there's a hub of some expertise up there. There's a lot of people who want to come work this over a weekend. We had sort of gauged some interest, and so we took our code, we open sourced it, which is really fun to do as an intelligence community agency. We're going to put our stuff out on GitHub. We did, actually pretty quickly. It was a great thing. And then we went up to Seattle, spent I think 36 hours essentially locked in the room with a bunch of developers, and people built some really incredible stuff that we're actually able to use sort of on the back end of this tool. So that's, I think, again, underscoring like we want to be sort of this sort of human problem and agency problem first team, and then we figure out what tech fits that.
And how closely do you work with these sort of commercial tech hubs? It seems like you had this hackathon in Seattle where you notice there's a concentration of talent, and I know NGA has an outpost in Silicon Valley, people in Boston, people stationed in commercial incubators. So how often do you personally, the two of you, interact or interface with the commercial tech sector and the digital attack team more broadly?
Yeah, early on, it was a lot more, especially when we were just trying to figure out like what are we doing, and we're doing a lot of the early engagement. I mean, I think we were in Silicon Valley for a bit, New York. We went to Boston, went to Seattle. I mean, there's a lot of stuff here in the local DC area. A lot of it was even just focusing on some early on venture capital firms, just seeing what is kind of when we had to look into how could we use AI to make an immediate impact. Well, what were some of the venture capital firms actually putting investment into, so the third member of our team, his whole job was as a tech scout, was to go out and learn what industry was doing and how can we take some of those pieces back internal, so we weren't just focused in our little bubble in Springfield. I know that they've since then they've stood up another outpost in San Antonio, and then the one in Boston is taking care of both Boston and New York.
Yeah, and we've benefited from that, especially when we go out. It's not just seeing what technologies are being developed. It's also really interesting to see what problems are being solved, and then sort of think analogously, like, do those problems exist in our space? Like, have we looked for that? We should go look for that. So that's been really helpful too, in sort of getting those contacts made and being in the tech community.
So I'm always interested when I talk to innovation themed teams when they work within a hierarchy or some sort of structure where you're expected to report your value and exactly what you're doing and how it translates to impact. So especially when you're asking some very open-ended questions, how do you deal with proving your value in sort of a structured, measured, metriced approach?
Yeah, I mean the data was so important. I mean all the what we talked about early on, getting all that interview data. When we at one point we took one of the conference rooms we have down in our basement and we just booked it for like 6 months. And we took all of the quotes from all the interviews that we had and we just put them on sticky notes all around the room. And then when we'd have like a meeting with a senior executive, we'd bring them down into our sticky note room. And so when they would ask us questions that were like, well, you can't do that, or that's not really a pain, we could go point to specific sticky notes on the wall and say, well, this data says otherwise. And that really kind of kept us going for a while. And then once we actually had a product and we were showing the actual time savings and I think the most interesting thing, and Chris talked about this a bit, was how it changed from us pushing the product to the teams using Conduit pushing the product for us. And it took a lot of weight and marketing pieces off of us to focus on the development side while they were like getting in front of all their leadership. I know we got an email one day that it was getting briefed to the senior executives at the Pentagon, and we're like, who's giving the briefing? And it was the team using the tool, briefing it out to the executives. We had no idea. We didn't know till after it happened.
Yeah, they kind of ran away with that. It was great. that helps tremendously. Right up until you're at that point, I think Brian nailed it. It's showing people those stories as quickly as possible, sort of making them physical, being able to move around them, and sort of getting those. It's really getting those executives sort of buy into that pain being real, and they start to feel it. And I think that's really when you sort of know that you're working on something good.
Yeah, just to touch on that, the storytelling piece became one of our most critical components of us being successful, because early on we were just throwing data out there and throwing numbers, and that was kind of what people expected. But as soon as we made the switch to telling stories out of the data, it was a whole different ballgame of people paying attention at that point, and even just getting some of the stories of what we're doing out to our internal teams helped us, let us keep going at that point.
So I wanted to open it up to audience questions. Does anyone have any right now, or should I? Great.
Oh, can you tell us a little bit more? I know you probably can't. Some of your clients, who they are, and the types of data you're talking about. Are we talking about satellite imagery? Are you talking about Ngo Partnerships?
Sure.
That sort of thing. And then talk a little bit more about these teams too, and their structured and their functionality.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, so I mean, generally our agency has two value centers. We work in sort of disaster relief, humanitarian assistance. This surprises some people. It's actually a really important mission that we do, and one that we devote a significant amount of resources to. So we do publish out information for that value center, and then we also have sort of a more traditional DoD intelligence community value center as well, where we're assisting policymakers, military decision makers. So at a very general level, largely we're looking, our product especially is sort of helping sort of completed intelligence products, sort of assessments of what's going on in the world, get out to those decision makers. That's kind of our sort of target market to start with. And then we've also had interest from other parts of the agency that do some of those other kind of value center kind of work.
And you asked specifically about the makeup of the teams that we were directly supporting, and they typically the teams that we focused on primarily were when we talked about the value chain and how our finished intelligence gets out to our customers. There was a pretty key point there on our their NJ support teams who are sitting out at customer sites, and their whole job is to take our products, our intelligence products that our analysts write, and get them disseminated to the briefers and the policymakers and the people who need to see those. So they're at a number of different, like what Christopher was describing earlier, a number of key points, like the Pentagon is the easiest example of one that's pretty obvious that we would send intelligence products to.
Other questions right now?
Sorry, could you please wait for the microphone?
You guys said that you went back to a program, and when you showed up, it seemed like, wow, that's a surprise because you guys went back and obviously had the information. A couple questions is, why did you go back? I mean, what makes you guys different in terms of the way that you look at programs that you're doing? Because it seems to me that you guys care. I mean, you're looking at a program, you're looking at a problem, and you're really building teams to say, gosh, how do we solve this problem from an IT all the way down from an infrastructure, from all the way down from the technical, all the way down to the program to implementation to result. And it just strikes me, hearing you guys, that you care about what you're doing, you care about the mission, you care about the teams that you guys are building. Am I reading that right?
He takes the feel-good questions, so.
That's my job as product designer. Yeah, I get to talk to the humans, not the technology. No, I think that there's capacity there for a lot of people to care that way, and I think a lot of people do. But for us, it's forcing ourselves out into a space where people are struggling or where people are having trouble doing their job. I think as soon as you get out there and you start to see some of that, that really clicks in. I think at first, various members of our team, I know we sometimes struggled around that. Like, what's the value of doing this? Like, we could just ask them. We could send out surveys. But I think seeing it in person motivated our team to the point where we became almost accidentally kind of a full stack team, the way you described. And we're willing to do that and sort of negotiate all that. And that was because we believed, because we had seen firsthand, the value that we could provide. I think it's similar to the way that you hear a lot of startups kind of get inspired. It's like, well, this was a problem for me. I saw this, or this is a problem for my friends or my neighbors or my family. So for us, it was a matter of just getting out, so it felt that real.
I'd mentioned too that so I didn't start out in the government side. I started out in sales in the commercial world, and it's like a lot of people become government employees not because of the money, not because of the huge benefits we get or whatever you want to sell on the government side. It's very much like a lot of people say, I'm here for the mission, right? So if you don't, it's one thing to say you're here for the mission, but it's another thing to actually be helping people to do the mission, support the warfighter, and take down, actually put effort towards that. Sometimes you'll have people that just kind of sit back and it's kind of let the job run itself. So this is actually us doing our job as federal employees, supporting these teams to do our job as NGA. So.
Hi, my name is Sophia. I'm the one and only innovation specialist at the U.S. Geological Survey, our civilian partner to NGA, right? And a question I have is, to what extent are you guys maybe filtering for certain kind of innovation projects that are sustainable innovation, just to kind of keep things running, to more disruptive innovation to really advance the agency beyond, because some of what our capabilities or our mission can be done on the commercial side, and it might be happening more and more. So are there aspects of what you are doing that you try to focus more on, like disruptive kinds of innovation?
Yeah, you're hitting right in my wheelhouse now, because we just stood up a new division. That's our Ventures Innovation Division under our Director of Future Capabilities. And so while we're focused on internal incubation, the other half of that is external incubation. And I can speak a lot more to the internal piece, where we're trying to build out a venture capital arm to support teams going through, like analyst teams coming up with an idea, and how could we put some initial investment into those teams to see if it's real. So we had roughly, I think it was 58 teams submit ideas. They got whittled down to 5 that are going through this 4-week accelerator program that we're running. And out of that, we have what we're calling the venture board, which is an investment board that is giving them some minimal investment or development resource support. And then we're using that to kind of spark some of these internal ideas. On the same side, there's a number of efforts going on with, I think our GeoEnt Solutions Marketplace might be going through a little bit of a revamp now, but how do we start bringing in some of the commercial technologies and do something similar on that side in support of what all of our outposts are doing at different locations, and trying to engage in the different groups around the nation. So I think the partnership opportunities, especially with like where you work, is there's a number of them. It's just finding out where would be the right place to fit in.
Yeah, and especially so, like, kind of bridging the gap between, what's going on inside of the agency and then a commercial company who's maybe developing something really disruptive, is often that they don't know those opportunities are there. So one of the things that we're doing is with teams going through the incubator, especially those who have like really kind of earth-shaking ideas, like, whoa, this changes the value center completely. I mean, we want to get them out of the building and talking to companies and getting a sense of what's out there. Because sometimes it's something, what we hope is that there will be things that are so different that we do need to come kind of out and look and see what's been done outside. So, yeah.
Just a quick question there. When you're saying you want to get them talking to, to get them out talking to other people to see what's out there, what exactly do you mean? What are you hoping they find?
Combination of companies, academia, research organizations. But if in terms of like what are they like hoping to get from all of those, I think it is a lot of where we see the future is sort of algorithmic. Is this idea that there are companies out there that if provided the data and sort of having that available to them, they could develop really incredible algorithmic capabilities. And I think that's one of the big kind of future areas that I know Anthony Vinci is looking at and is making a priority for us. So.
I know, like for us specifically, we went out and talked to content curation companies, specifically the ones that had, machine learning capabilities or some of the AI pieces that we were looking into, and just getting conversations and understanding of what they were doing, and what are the potentials of, would it make sense for us to go out and purchase this rather than build it ourselves? Part of the accelerator I just described, the 3rd week of that is our, we call it Market Factors Week, but a major portion of that is go visit venture capital firms, like Christopher was saying. If you're building a Waze for tanks, go talk to Waze. Go if you're doing anything in regards to like mapping off of Google Earth, go talk to the people on the Google Earth team. And a lot of times that kind of freaks people out a little bit, but once they make the first phone call, they get over that pretty quickly. Yeah.
Are they mostly freaked out because they might be sharing something that's potentially classified, or or is it a cultural thing? They just don't know how to interface with the commercial tech sector?
Yeah, it's part culture, it's part, it's not really if you've been an analyst for 10 years, your job isn't to go out and start calling companies all the time, especially in the IC. So, a lot of people get trained in making very comfortable making these phone calls and talking to these people, but if you've never done that before, it's just out of your scope of what you know. So
I think that's actually the hard part. It's surprising, but that is actually the hard part. It's less the sort of like you're going to say something you shouldn't. I think most of these people have been doing this job for long enough. They know how to manage that. It's really the cultural thing.
Sure. Any other questions right now?
Real quick, just to piggyback off of that, I'm sorry. So do you think that they find it difficult to find a counterpart in which they can communicate what they want effectively to in order to get the proper product in line?
So like a counterpart out in like the commercial sector, or that's a good question.
I think it depends on the project itself. A lot of times, I can't think of a scenario where you can't find some type of analogous inspiration to what you're doing in some way, shape, or form. I mean, almost every new idea comes off of something analogous to something else. And usually if you can find that piece for them, even if it's a loose connection, they can start connecting the dots and it'll lead them to the person they need to talk to. So there's a lot of just some general techniques that you can go through just to get people making phone calls. We use a lot of local accelerators or incubators just to go out there and have them sit for a bit and talk to people there, and you never know who's going to connect you. It's just pure networking type stuff.
Other questions? I have a couple more. Well, I just wanted to ask you where you see the organization going. So we've talked about potential recruiting and maybe changing the structure a little bit. So just wanted to get a sense of what the next steps are.
I think we realized that we're not going to be able to hire, 1,000 government employees to come in and do this type of work. So it's how do we start to train our internal teams to do something similar in coordination with some of these other product teams in the commercial world that are selling us products. Like Christopher mentioned earlier about how do we get that product, user-focused mindset into, everybody from our analyst teams to our contract teams to our acquisition teams. They just put our group right in the middle of the acquisition office, which was kind of an interesting time, that's for sure. But the part of it's how can we share the knowledge across the different parts of the organization. But the focus right now is very much on training some of our internal teams so that we can scale it within NGA, and then we'll see how it goes from there.
A worthy point there is probably how we train. We train by getting people to do. Class time is like 3 mornings a week, and the rest of the time you are interviewing people, you're on the phone, you're traveling to work sites, you're getting together with your team and saying, how do we make sense of this problem? You're building something, you're visiting a company. And all the people who train for the most part have done this work. So we try not to set it up as a classroom setting. I think that's really important in government. There's lots of classroom settings you can make your way into, and so how we train has been really important. And we're trying to structure the organization for that too, so that our sort of doer teams also kind of rotate in and do some training.
Yeah, we went out and watched how people like Steve Blank teach his entrepreneur classes out in New York, or going out to Stanford and watching how Stanford teaches some of their MBA classes, really high-end, high-speed. I mean, these are people who are trying to come up with ideas for new startups that are going to be going up for millions of dollars in investment. And how can we train our analyst teams to think in that same mindset as an entrepreneur? And so that's been quite the experience of trying to just get the sense of urgency there and getting these teams to do something similar.
Well, what I find interesting when I hear about trying to replicate this model within government is that in the private sector, the people who are starting companies are often motivated by profit, right? And the motivations are very different in government. You are obviously trying to impact people and trying to change the way they use technology, but you've got a safety net. If the product fails, you're still kind of there. So what do you take from the private sector?
That's a really fair point. I think that one of the ways to tackle that, I think it was a couple questions ago, Brian mentioned we got stats, we got data really quickly. It's hard to quantify mission impact, which I think is what we sub for sort of profit sometimes. We say for how much, or what we sub for sort of inlay, right? So for how much effort you're putting into this, for how much it's costing you, how much mission impact are you having? But we do encourage teams to develop metrics around that. And to hold them accountable to that, so that there is actually sort of a fire at your feet saying, are you out there making a difference in this measurable way? That's been really important to us. The emphasis on sort of driving metrics has been really huge. I think that's something we actually did get kind of from the private sector. It's just, it's a little harder actually in a sense. The metrics don't sort of come easily. You have to go look for that. If it's something like what we built, it's, products produced, products briefed, decisions made on those briefings. There's a couple, alternatives there. But it's really in getting metrics that'll sort of force you to be honest with that.
I will say too that the teams that are going through it now, they have full-time analyst jobs, right? So they're being the director of analysis gave these teams their first set of investment, kind of their angel funding, if you will, was taking them off their job to focus purely on their idea. So if their idea doesn't end up working out after a couple months, that's not necessarily horrible, but they'll go back to their job and hopefully they'll come up with the next idea and they can continue to learn or share that with the rest of the analysts on their team. So you can run out of funding. There is a runway there that you will, if your product doesn't really take off, then you're back in your current day-to-day job. So that's kind of an interesting take on, while it's not necessarily direct funding, there is a risk piece tied to it.
Sure, and unless there are other questions, just one final really quick. Sorry, you got one?
When you guys develop something like a new product or anything, do you guys consider a monetization model to that? In other words, if you take something oh, thank you. In other words, I think the monetization model is real important to pay attention to, especially if you're talking about something that's going to convert into the commercial sector. So if something can be done for a small amount of money, a small amount of investment, that has a big idea, a big profit margin, then it's allowed to scale. But if it's something that costs so much to develop, and the cost and the research and everything, and then even the deployment or even the support to that product is so overwhelming from a cost model that it's just simply not going to work. Do you guys consider that at all in terms of what you guys do and where you guys go?
Yeah, that's so there's like 10 key factors that we look through in our scoring criteria for the venture board, and that is absolutely one of the biggest ones. Is exactly, it's great. We just spent $10,000 building this cool prototype, but it's going to cost us $30 million every year for the next 20 years to continue to get this data. Well, that doesn't work out. There's no reason to invest in that. We're not going to be able to afford that long term. What are some of the other ways that we could maybe get some of the similar data, or do it slightly different to be able to bring that in? But that is absolutely the funding model behind that is looked into, and that's one of the reasons why we're changing some of this investment strategy. One of the things I think you'll see when we just watched one of the teams who their initial estimates were going to be something like 800 million, crazy number. And when they actually broke it down to what they would need to get started, it was more like 35 million. So right there, they just paid for their 2 months out of the office. So there's ways that you start to see when they start thinking outside the box and do a non-traditional requirements style method. There's a lot of cost savings to be had in that model.
I think maybe just one. Last one.
So I have a question about sort of initial buy-in. So it seems great once you have the Post-it notes that you can convince senior executives that this was all worthwhile. But if I come from aerospace and defense, if I'm at NASA, and I'm trying to convince them that, we should be designing new decision support tools or interfaces using your model, how do I convince an administrator, senior director that this is a good idea? Or I guess, how did you guys get started in the first place convincing someone to even believe in this with no data?
Yeah, I can send you the briefing that I gave my boss to get it started if you'd like it. We had some really good leadership, and they're part of the leaders that we had. They've moved on to other roles now, but they gave us a lot of early on freedom, knowing that. They told us we're going to give you a month. That was what we started out with, and at the end of this month, come brief us, and we'll see how you're doing. And if that goes well, then we'll give you another month. And so the model that we built out was basically giving this monthly review of everything that we had. I will tell you, the first project that we did went horrible. But there was we had enough data from showing that there's actually something here and how people were responding to us that they let us keep going. But that takes a really good leader to be aware of that. And we got lucky that we were put in that position.
Yeah, that was a fun moment. I remember that, like the kind of almost failed completely moment. I'd say ask yourself if you have an idea, what's the sort of riskiest assumption in that idea? Whether it's people will use it, whether it's the technology exists, and then go to your management with the shortest ask of time that you possibly can to go test that thing. If it's literally like, give me a day and I'll just test this bit of it, but if I test that and I prove that I'm right here, I want a little bit more time. I think it's kind of like stage your asks that way and make it about just how much learning can I do in the smallest amount of time to validate this idea.
We, during our course that we teach, the 4-week accelerator, we actually used 2 different scenarios from NASA from when they were working on the Apollo missions and how they would do some of their prototyping for the space vehicles and when they get caught up in certain scenarios. So like one of them's, I think the movie's From the Earth to the Moon, and there's a scene from there that we use. And then the other piece of that is talking about bureaucracy and when the astronauts come back from the moon, how they have to submit their travel vouchers. And that they bring anything from this, out of the United States, and we thought that was kind of silly that you're submitting a travel voucher for an astronaut. But I always think of NASA as being one of the more innovative organizations. So I think that with that mindset there, you would have a lot of fuel to be able to go push that with your supervisors. Remember the good old days, right?
I know I have a million more questions, but we have to wrap it up. So thank you so much for joining us, and please join me.
Thanks, everybody.